My name's David McNair from Save the Children. Thanks for the presentation and for the discussions. It seems that we all agree that broadening the tax base is the right thing to do, but the question is how is it done? And it strikes me that the issue of tax administration is a key issue. So are there any examples in the South Asian region or in the Asian region more broadly where specific management changes have resulted in that broadening of the tax base? I'm thinking of what Gareth's referred to in terms of Pakistan and the challenges, both in terms of political economy, but also in the nuts and bolts of managing a tax administration.
All right, very good. The lady over here, on the left.
My name is Heidi. I'm working for ODI, Climate and Environment Program, specifically climate finance. I'm originally from Indonesia, and I'm economist by training. My question is more maybe stretching a bit further to the inclusive growth, whether actually the assessment or the assumptions includes also environmental assessment, or how's the impact of the growth itself to environment. And I have recently an opportunity to visit coal mining activity in Kalimantan, and that's in Indonesia. And as we know, coal mining, and it's one of the drivers of economy as a fuel. And it seems that the fact on the ground, it's quite frustrating in my point of view, looking at how mining activities actually leads to crop failures of people who not have sufficient water, because the water is captured in the inside of the hole, which is just abandoned after the mining activities itself. And how can this actually, as we expect maybe growth more in the future, and how can this, how can we tackle these issues if we want to see inclusive growth in the future? So. Okay.
Brilliant, thank you. So we had two questions from the audience, but we had a range of comments also from the discussants here. So maybe I'd like to give you also a chance. So I think a key question is what David I think was raising here, is the how. What's next? So we now know that we need to increase the tax base because we think that is important. And if you increase the tax base, that might be progressive in itself, because you can spend to reduce income distribution. But how do you do it? And do you have examples? And do you have examples of tax administrations that have done that have shifted the income tax base by a significant percentage point of change? Do we have examples? Can we look at the Asian experience? Are there any other experiences out there? So if you have first would like to sort of answer this comment and maybe the other comments, and then maybe come back also to the panel if they have anything else to add on this particular question.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, the very good question. Now, how to broaden tax base? Of course, I mean that depends on the country's circumstances. So each country will have a different situation. I can certainly talk about China. In the case of China, for instance, China currently personal income tax as a percent of GDP is less than 1.5%, about 1.3%, something like that. So very low. I think the independent estimates saying that less than 2 or 3% the population pay income tax. So we know that China really does not have a kind of a well-designed personal income tax system. At the moment, the income tax collected, but on the separate items, no? There's more than about 15 items separated tax, and then you apply different threshold, and then some are progressive, some are just flat. So I think the government now is trying to do is to consolidate. So the personal income tax will be taxed on consolidated basis, like UK. So you have to report all this, and many other countries. At the moment, China does not have this system. So basically, that by on tax personal income tax on a consolidated basis will improve the progressiveness, because when you have high income, so if you consolidate all the income, and you can have a higher personal income tax rate. Another example, again in the case of China, wage income, for instance, the threshold when you apply top marginal rate, 45%, that is 45% top marginal rate, top tax rate is equivalent, actually not low, but if you look at the threshold, when the tax rate applied only your personal income, annual income reach 25 times of per capita GDP on average. So in OECD country, I think it's normally about 5 times. So that you start applying the top rate. But in case of China, Pakistan is the same, more than 20 times. Then so what I'm saying, if you lower that threshold, then you have a more higher income earners will start paying tax. So that is another way. Then of course tax administration or this China needs to develop that kind of system, data system in ICT or this. I think currently is going on. There's a plan to do that. And certainly that is something in the government mind. Now another example is the Philippines. The Philippines, we know that tax revenue as a percent of GDP very low, 12% a few years back, now increased like 15%. I think the Philippines has done, in recent years, has done quite a bit in terms of improved tax collection. The ADB actually, we provided technical assistance, loans, and to improve it. We're working with the tax bureau to improve their data system, you know. And then I think they have set up some kind of unit to target the big taxpayer, the very rich people, to make sure that the ones will pay in tax, monitor closely. So I think recently Philippines obviously tax revenue as percent of GDP, and the current administration increased. So, but of course, still more needs to be done because even that is still low. Tax evasion is widespread. So, but in any case, these are something that could develop, and we see. I can mention that. Yeah. So this is a question on tax.
Are there any other examples that you were to bring in sort of, I mean, Oliver or Francesca or Gareth? I mean, you point out to the challenges, but are there any examples that you know of in the Asian region where it actually has gone well, where you see the tax to GDP ratio have gone up, and what happened there in terms of increasing the personal income tax?
I mean, in India, there's paid a lot of attention to try to the use of IT and so forth, because you know when it was a taxman coming round in a country with widespread corruption, this was a way of expanding tax revenue and removing the opportunity for the taxman to sort of take some of the money and people to pay less in income tax. But the limits go back to the, you know, it's a question in South Asia of the large informal sector, which you're never going to get to through income tax. That in India, the formal sector is around 50 million out of 1.2 billion. So however effectively you do it, you're still limited to that 50 million. I think the other point that would make a lot of difference would be to simplify the system. Certainly in the case of India, where you have huge amounts of exemptions and then subsidies. There was a scheme proposed, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, in relation to corporation tax, which was saying instead of having this really complex system that everyone has to spend huge amounts on accountants for, we should just have a flat rate, get rid of all the subsidies and exemptions and have a flat rate of around 20%. And within hours, the various Indian industry groups came together and said, actually, our effective tax rate at the moment is 19.8%, so this isn't actually going to help us, because they actually benefited from this very complex system. So simplifying the system would seem to be the low-hanging fruit, but then it is opposed by the vested interests that benefit from the more complex system.
Well, I can't give examples from Asian countries, but there are some examples from African countries. And yeah, a number of the countries have implemented what they would call autonomous revenue authorities, where essentially what you try to do is divorce tax collection from the ministry, and it's an independent agency, and the evidence suggests that has has led to increases in collection efficiency. Now, whether that leads to a it often leads to a sudden increase in revenue, but then it kind of stabilizes again. It does seem to improve collection efficiency, and perhaps that's what tax administration does. You can, and there are a lot of ways using technology. For example, in Ethiopia, for collecting value-added tax, they're now using I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's kind of an electronic measurement at the point of transfer. So when people purchase something, it's all electronically recorded. And as everybody registers for that, it improves the information and again should improve the efficiency of tax collection. But that won't affect the base. So the tax administration, you can make collection more efficient. But it's ultimately policy and the politicians who determine the thresholds, the rates, the exemptions and exceptions, and certainly, yes, South Asia does seem to be a world leader in exemptions and exceptions. Anything I know of Pakistan and everything I've heard of Bangladesh does put them as real world leaders. So it's just a surprise that anybody pays any income tax in those countries, because they must be very badly politically connected if they have to end up paying tax. And that's a politics issue. But really, I think that perhaps you should think of the tax base, which is going to be determined by the structure of growth. Think of that more like a constraint, because perhaps you can't do much about that. You're always, you may always have a large informal sector, however you define it in these countries. So, and yeah, you can think of introducing VAT. Again, that still won't cover a lot of these people. They might be purchasing from traders who are not registered from VAT because it's a low-level trade. So it may improve efficiency, but it's still not the same thing as expanding the base. So maybe you need to think of the tax base as a constraint.
Right.
Just very quickly, on the question of informality, I think there are examples of ways in which workers that are operating in the informal sector can be included into a tax system, and also into, for instance, contributory-based programs. And you just, Gareth, mentioned simplifying the tax bureaucracy or tax rules to create incentives and facilitate those in the informal sector to contribute to these programs. And certainly across Latin America, part of the expansion, for instance, of social protection has taken place through these types of initiatives targeting the self-employed, independent workers that were largely excluded from formal social insurance mechanisms, through program rules, by essentially simplifying the system and making it more advantageous and desirable to participate in paying contributions, and then benefiting also from the spending and benefits that arise from contributing to social insurance programs.
Okay. I will bring in the gentleman in a minute.
Sorry, no, just one thing. Obviously, that doesn't affect the question of low-wage employment. So, again, it might be a way of expanding the base in some sense of numbers, but if the wages are low, or incomes are low, then the revenue raised will remain low. But, yeah, that's all.
I suppose there's also a question in relation to the major focus of your report is the... so if we say that we need that an increase in tax base is very important, and if we then also say that in order to do this, there needs to be formal employment. So you've got informal employment in various countries that do not lead to greater tax base. Then the question is, how do you get there with a formal tax base? And but your report will say, well, actually, we need to shift. We need to shift away the tax policy towards targeting for growth, but more towards distributional issues. Is there sort of a conundrum here that it's what comes first? Do we need first to get growth in employment intensive manufacturing and other activities, and then that will create a tax base which can then lead to redistribution, or do we need to redistribute first and then so is there a conundrum here? Maybe you could briefly comment on that, because it seems to be a big question in relation to the shift in focus of tax policy in the Asian region that you'd like to highlight.
Right.
And then I'll go back to the audience.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, as I mentioned, actually 2 years ago we have a report. We specifically look at the broad picture of inequality and the broad policy options. So number one, actually, and not number one, but we come, as I mentioned, the 4 policy options. One is to make growth more employment friendly. So that is this year, but we are focusing on fiscal policy. This does not necessarily mean we think that others are not important. They're equally important, but particularly this year we are looking at how the fiscal policy can be used to address rising inequality. And we believe that, of course, I mean, countries differ. South Asia, East Asia, for instance, difference very big. But overall, by and large, focused more on Asia, more on fiscal policy, more on growth, infrastructure, for instance, but less on education and health. But if you look at the numbers, that is a fact. So that is what we're seeing. We need to move also.
Needs to rebalance.
That's right. And at the same time, of course, infrastructure needs, for instance, still there, and then larger gap in infrastructure, and also addressing to address this inequality issue, you need other the policies. Address informality obviously is important, and then we need to find out what are the causes of informality, and informality is more particularly significant in the problem for South Asia and India, and a lesser problem in East Asia, for instance, or even in Southeast Asia. So we need to look at it. But the point I try to say is we are looking at this issue. We are not saying that these others are not important. They're still important. But if we look at how fiscal policy can be used better to address this rising inequality, these are the things.
Okay.
Yeah. So that is, yeah.
All right. Good. The gentleman over there.
Thank you.
I think we need a microphone. William is bringing the microphone to you.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Bill Thompson, and I want to thank Dr. Chang for his presentation. I've got 2 points I'd like to make. The first would be, if I can go back to your macroeconomic projections, and I'd like to ask you if you can say a bit more about China. Now, you said 7.5%, but I know the government says it's going to be 7.5%, but clearly the real estate bubble is bursting there, particularly outside the coastal cities. And some of the figures I've seen show that the private credit levels in China now are in fact higher than they were in the United States at the time that their housing bubble burst. So clearly there is potential for something nasty to happen there, and when it happens, it tends to happen quickly. How do you think, if that were to happen, what would that effect would that have on the region? Obviously it would have a major impact on China's growth rate for 1 or 2 years. But what would be the impact on the region? And what do you think the government's response will be? Obviously they must be looking at this and have plans in their hip pockets. So that's the first point, question I'd like to make on the macro side. On the other side about taxation, I'd like to ask whether this is being you know, which I think is a very good presentation, the comparison with the other regions. Is this being driven by ADB and the donors towards the countries, or is this something that the countries want to do themselves? Because I will never forget a time when I was meeting with a finance minister of a Southeast Asian country, and I raised some issue about, I think it was education, expenditure and health. And he almost threw me out the room. He said, we have no intention of ever introducing anything like the European welfare system here. I wasn't even proposing that, but that was the sort of reaction. So I wonder, clearly this is, as the economies develop, they become wealthier and they become older. It's natural that these sort of policies are gradually put in place. My experience has been that clearly as countries develop, they get more sophisticated systems, and the systems that seem to work particularly well are Singapore and Hong Kong, where obviously you've got very simple systems there. The income tax is not an income tax as we'd understand it, it's a salaries tax. No capital gains tax, no interest tax, nothing like that. But it's in force, it's automatic. And of course they rely heavily on property taxes. And then on top of that you have the mandatory provident fund, both for Hong Kong and Singapore. My experience, personal experience, is I own a place in the Philippines, and my property tax on that house, which is a very nice house, is £200 a year.
Yeah.
That's 1/10 of what I pay on a much inferior place here, and you know, about 5% of what I used to pay on a place that wasn't as good or as nice in Virginia. So I mean, there is clearly enormous scope on the property front to raise taxes. I mean, that's immobile. People can't avoid it, and you know, and even there's probably not that much ability to avoid paying it through graft. So those are just some comments. Thank you.
All right, maybe so two comments, Sheila, and then over there.
Thank you. Sheila Page, ODI. Two comments. First, related to the second, but also to Gareth's point about the Lamborghini. And I had similar experiences, 2 trips to China 30 years apart. Is this actually a change not just in China and India? It wasn't a Chinese politician who said he was relaxed about people becoming rich. That is going to make it much harder to reform tax systems, because the attitudes towards displayed wealth are different now. And the only places I can think of where there's been any fairly strong reaction are sort of Lula in Brazil and to some extent in Chile. So these are political changes, but not just political in the sense in which you meant it. They are major changes. Is this what is going to be required in some of the Asian countries, and is it feasible? It's an unfair question to ask an economist. And a slightly fairer question to Dr. Zhang. You mentioned 2 other elements in inequality, regional disparities and social exclusion. For regional, you said something about spending in regions to counter it. I wondered whether you really thought that was effective, or whether we simply have to allow people to move from poor regions to rich. And if you could say a little bit more about what your policy conclusions on social exclusion are.
Okay, then the lady over here, and then we'll go back to you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Ulla Bago. I'm an economist and traveling around in social protection, so I represent the other aspects of this. So just to put it into context, in terms of decline in poverty, it would appear that, yes, there's been an impressive decline in poverty, but the chronic extreme poverty rate is going up at the same time. So, and that represents also social exclusion issues. So these people are much harder to sort of get into the mainstream employment, livelihood areas. So you can't actually just sit there and wait for the growth to come through. So there must be social protection programs for them. And we also put it into the context of the post-2015 social sustainable development goals. We talk about, in terms of chronic poverty and poverty, by 2025 there should be a zero poverty. So if you sort of put it into context and looking at what kind of investment and structural reforms would be necessary to do that. And also in terms of informal and formal employment, there is a huge gender issue there, and certainly in the informal employment sector, women and young children and girl children are much more at risk than men sometimes. And then also the final one, to put it into context of the decent work agenda, which started out under ILO, but is now a sort of a mainstream. Everybody has that on the agenda now, and as part of that, the social protection floor. So one, decent work, access to good work, and social protection at the same time. And social protection can be both used as a safety net, as a risk management, but also as empowerment. Although conditional cash transfers have been a big success in terms of mothers and children in Latin America, it should go beyond that actually and empower people, and not. There is a little bit of a risk of locking large populations in sort of a little trap there without the empowerment. And empowerment is, of course, access to skills development, access to livelihood, education, etc. So just that one.
Very good. So two types of questions, Dr. Zhang. I think the first is also from a macroeconomic nature, and I think we would all love to hear more on the position of China. So if you think about the forecast that the Bank of England is doing in terms of its for the UK, it has a nice Venn chart and sort of thinks about probabilities and so on to see where are the risks. So I would love for you to talk a bit more about the challenges out there. So what is the sort of the mean projection, but then what are the risks out there? Are they maybe 0.2 up, 0.2 down, or actually are we talking about maybe 2% up or 2% down? So if there's a huge fiscal stimulus, maybe up, or if there is the debt bubble is exploding, are we actually talking about quite a sort of hard landing? Of course, we have talked about for quite a number of years, but now the sort of the debt issues are coming to the forefront in some of the newspaper articles, and we'd like to sort of maybe if you could outline sort of the risks and the and some of the certainties here that we do or do not know. And the other were a range of questions about fiscal policy on different aspects, about attitudes, property taxes, about chronic poverty, gender issues, and other issues. And also want to bring in Gareth after that. But I think for you now a range of questions here. So over to you, Dr.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So first, let me talk about the macroeconomic the issue in China. I think, as I said, our projection is overall we are still, I think, positive. We are not that negative in the sense that not worried about the probability of hard landing, as some of the investment houses put out there. So overall, 7.5% is our baseline projection. Of course, there's a possibility growth can go lower, but I think the basic thinking is maybe will not go as low below 7%. This is a kind of floor for the government before that, to take really the important actions. But of course, the government has started taking action as the last few days. The State Council announced a number of measures in terms of increasing investment in railway and then social housing and the tax breaks for small and micro enterprises. These are considered as the mini stimulus. And then the easing of monetary policy cannot be ruled out if there's a need. But overall, I think we feel still okay. And then there's issue of credit risks. Again, the shadow banking, local government debt. But if you look at the shadow banking, the size of the shadow banking is not that. Of course, it depends on how you estimate. There are different estimates, but still, we think the size is not that very high compared to other countries. And local government debt is more certain because we know the government has an auditing report that came out last year. So about 35% of GDP. Then plus China's central government debt as a percent of GDP less than 20%. So that if we put it together is about 50% of GDP. So more is a credit, the private sector debt, the corporate debt. Household debt is not very high, less than 30% of GDP. So it's basically corporate debt. That is a concern. Yeah. But on the other hand, also we know that corporate debt, a lot of things is basically the project, the investment made, and I mean this is more uncertainty over there.
Do you think there's overcapacity, so that if they've invested in overcapacity?
Certainly, there is one of the factors. For instance, just several weeks ago, there's even very recently the collapse of this what is it, solar company, the default. But I think the default probably incidents were increasing over time. But of course, I mean, it's even small because in China, the bankrupt, that kind of thing, default actually not very common, now become more. So I get into the headline. But then for other countries, more often you actually would not get noticed because this is normally you have that. But in China, it's not common. So now become, even though the few cases, yeah. So I think overall, I mean, of course, because of lack of data, it's very difficult to precisely what is the risk given with a number. Now, important thing is the government is get noticed, to pay attention to the measures. For instance, last December, come up with guidelines to regulate shadow banking. And now the government, also the local government, they try to develop kind of formal financing mechanisms for local government. Because part of the local government debt, of course, is because the lack of formal, because they cannot issue bonds for infrastructure development. So there, in the past, is the sales revenue from land. Right? Now is more difficult. So needs to find more formal, allow local governments issuing bonds. Municipal bond, for instance, but it now is being planned, and the finance minister recently indicated that it will go ahead. And that, of course, it needs to be regulated or monitored closely. So overall, I think I don't agree with the mention about the housing bubble burst. So actually, we don't think there's a bubble, but of course, certain areas price very high. Shanghai, Beijing, for instance. But overall, I mean, there are also third-tier cities, maybe the so-called ghost town and the empty. But overall, prices are high and will slow down a bit, but not a kind of a bubble will burst that stage because China is still huge demand, urbanization for housing. So that is on. So we are still cautiously optimistic. But given that notice the risks, the government is taking care of that. That's the one. Fiscal, I think there are a number of issues mentioned. Just to go through the timing issue. The professor mentioned timing when the political sensitivity, if you have to do reform or whatever. So, but that, of course, this is the issue. But even that, for instance, Malaysia now in trying to reform is a VAT system. Malaysia does not have a proper VAT, so now they want to introduce that as recently because of the fiscal deficit the government experienced. Now trying to address. So depend on, of course, there are several countries have elections, and Indonesia, India. So that, of course, probably will make this more difficult. But still, of course, we're not talking about it's just direction. These are the things we'll have to do. But I agree this politically sensitive issue if we're talking about tax. but still needs to make it. Poverty, you mentioned about a lot of basically just lift out of the poverty, but still very low income. I agree. According to our projection, if we use a $1.25 a day, this is the World Bank, this is a global poverty line, $1.25 a day. By 2024, in Asia will be no poverty, or will be eliminated by 2024, if you use that. But if our argument, we think this $1.5 a day poverty line is too low, because that is basically was based on more Africa data. When the World Bank work out this poverty line, only 2 Asian countries are included. Most of the countries are from Africa. So we recalculated, if using Asian data, Asian countries' data, poverty line higher, much higher, just basic. This is extreme poverty. But we think that there are other considerations. For instance, the issue, of course, income become higher, and then the basic needs increasing. Now is access to mobile phone, ICT, internet. These are the basic things. So we should also consider this thing in defining poverty line. So we are working on a report arguing that Asia needs to increase the raise the poverty line on the basis of national poverty line. A lot of countries have a national poverty line much higher than $1.25 a day. And also, this is one. And a second issue is the professor mentioned about vulnerability. Most of people lie between $1.25 a day and $2 a day. So, and then vulnerable, the shock, they easily fell into poverty. So we think that part, because that needs to be considered also. So there are many of the other, a few other issues, and we're thinking that we have not officially said that we should use $2 a day. So most likely we're thinking this is something we have not announced. Our president, we discussed with our president, he's very much like the idea to that we should increase the poverty, raise the poverty.
Your life,
huh? yeah. So but that's exactly what level will we have to? Certainly it will be higher. And conditional cash transfer, I did not mention, but we do support, and ADB. We have loans to Indonesia and to Philippines. We are promoting this conditional cash transfer. The problem with Asia is some countries, this conditional cash transfer, there's in China, for instance, probably not that easy to work, because if somebody, there's kind of an attitude, they don't like to be seen as relying on the government, So for instance, if somebody knows the family is relying on conditional cash transfer, so your daughter, your son probably will be difficult to find, husband or wife, because it's kind of thinking. But I don't know. This is maybe different from other countries. So that is culturally, the kind of issue. We don't want to be seen as So it's more provide physical services, maybe easier to accept. So I don't know on poverty. Then what else?
The potential for. So we still have about 15 minutes. So we'll bring in the audits as well. But there was about the potential for property taxes, I think. But there was also specifically a question about attitudes, I think, towards distribution and or inequality. I don't know, so that was maybe also to Gareth. I don't know. Do you want to say something on this issue, or shall I bring in Gareth maybe? And then
I mean, I suppose thinking about South Asia, the interesting thing is just how quick the transformation has been. That is not even in a generation, it's in 10, 15 years. And it's not that long ago that people in Delhi were saying we don't want to be like Brazil and live in gated communities. And that discussion doesn't happen anymore because they live in gated communities. And I suppose there's, there are two reactions to it, one positive, one less positive, to the link between, development and exclusion. That in central India there's a correlation between Naxalite Maoist rebels and mining projects. And essentially, and it goes back to the point about property taxes and property compensation, that it is the issue of poor people being evicted and undercompensated, if compensated at all, for their land. So that's one. And I suppose the other one, which again goes back to the whole question about taxation. 10 years ago, Arvind Kejriwal resigned from the Indian Revenue Service to campaign against corruption. And for a few months earlier this year, he was Chief Minister of Delhi. And who knows what will happen in the election. But his whole campaign is on exactly this issue, that the system needs to be shaken up. And it goes back to all of these fundamental questions of how the system works for everyone rather than for a few non-taxpayers at the top.
So on the issue of property taxes, so I think that there was a question about sort of the potential of this, and also, so it seems to me that it's an obvious target. One question is it going to raise big numbers in terms of revenues? Don't know whether you want to come in, Oliver, on property taxes.
Just a brief comment is, most of the evidence, property taxes are known to be quite useful as local taxes, especially in urban areas. And of course that's entirely consistent with them being quite useful in Hong Kong and Singapore, because they are essentially city-states. But I suppose two aspects is it's difficult beyond the local to generate large revenues from them, in particular because as you try to increase the tax rate, collection becomes far more expensive. You have an issue of how do you value. If the tax rate is low, you can have a fairly low cost valuation. But if you're starting to make that tax rate high, then it's much easier for people to contest a valuation. There'll be more legal disputes. It becomes a lot more expensive to collect. Even in developed countries, there are, even in London, I think property taxes are rather a big issue. So you can have you can sustain a relatively simple council tax type thing where nobody thinks too much about how it's being valued. But if you're trying to go further than that and actually generate real revenue from it, it becomes very difficult.
Do you see it as the future in developing Asia, property taxes?
For some countries, yes. The Philippines, for instance, you mentioned about. I recently found, because I was thinking to buy a property and found out actually property tax in the Philippines is very low. And China is being very much discussed now because, as I said, is try to find a stable source of revenue for local government. So that is being piloted in few cities. I think will soon be applied to all the areas. I think that is important. And then on average, as I said, for Asian countries, 1.7% of GDP is the property tax. But I agree with the professor. The total, even OECD countries, average is about 2 to 3% of the GDP from property tax revenue. So that's I agree. That number is not very big. Yes.
Okay. Very good. So maybe we should have a last round of questions from the audience. If there are any important issues we'd like to see clarified, particularly from Dr. Zhang or from the panel. So there are two questions there. The gentleman and the lady.
Robin Broadway. I work at LSE and I'm a former staff member of ADB. I wonder if you or the panel have any comments on the ideas expressed in Thomas Piketty's new book on capital. His argument is that income from capital, or the capital itself, is growing faster than growth. And this will mean that the rich become richer. Is there any thought on perhaps more ideas on taxing property and capital?
Okay. And on your left, there's somebody who would like to say.
Hi, my name's Deborah Hardeen. I'm from Oxfam. My question follows on from what Gareth said last, actually, about shaking up the system. And I think talking about inequality and it being potentially a self-enforcing system when the political elite, the business elite, setting the rules for taxation systems and so on, and helping to decide how the money gets spent, to actually enforce a progressive fiscal policy requires, I think, to really address that capture of the political system. So how do we go about doing that? How do we break down those kind of the capture of that system in the top? And I think a second constraint to achieving a progressive system is also the international taxation system. So at the moment, it's possible for people to take all their wealth and their income and put them in tax havens overseas. So how does how do we approach these two sort of constraints to actually achieving a progressive system?
All right, very good. So these are sort of big questions. So one issue about sort of I think it's related to the labour share in income, or the share of capital in income, and the other two questions is about sort of how do we shake up the system? Do we have some examples of where things have radically changed? How do you get out of the virtuous circle? And I suppose, a new issue that we haven't discussed very much, but is very much alive in when it comes to poorer countries in the G8 and the G20 discussions about taxation is international taxation, of course transfer pricing, but also tax evasion, tax avoidance. So I remember sort of when I looked at Singapore years ago, if you look at the to invest there, then you get a whole rule book to go with 500 pages of tax exemptions and so on. And I mean, Singapore has used the tax system to come up with value-added ladder, but maybe not all countries can actually do that. And there's a big question there about sort of what is the role of exemptions, but particularly is tax evasion, tax avoidance. How do you see this debate developing in developing Asia with the transfer pricing issue? Have you looked into this issue? These are taking it back to the G20 issue.
Okay, thank you. Tax income, the capital income versus labor. Now, actually, our view, what we will try to see in our report is that fiscal policy to address inequality. First, you look at spending. Spending is more effective than revenue side. But of course, spending needs to be financed, so we need to find the right revenue sources. And then try to find more revenues. And we think that, if, for instance, VAT is regressive, but if VAT is generated additional revenue used for education, health kind of spending, whether in a market or not in a market, as the professor mentioned, so that overall will be progressive. So actually, we are not thinking to redistribution sort of tax for the sake of redistribution. The purpose is to collect revenue sources to finance the spending, additional spending. So that is our view, and of course we still talk about tax on properties, tax on capital gains, and inheritance. But the focus is not. I think because IMF, for instance, several weeks ago, came up with a report also on fiscal policy. They are talking about spending as well as tax the revenue to address rising inequality. But their policy options focus both on developing country as well as developed country. So, but I focus on developing country on it. In the context of developing country, we believe the spending is more effective. But in order to have a more finance spending, you need revenue. And then you design a system that's easy to collect, efficient, and fair in the sense that people are willing to pay tax, but not try to just for the sake of redistribution and not try to so not that kind of that thinking. That is. I don't know whether it is clear or makes sense or not.
Well, if you don't address redistribution, the rich are going to get richer.
No, that of course yes, but on the other hand, Yeah, but basically it's how to trade off, trade off the efficiency versus equity. Yeah, so that of course I agree that. But in the case of China, just an example again, although I said labor income share has been declining, but now actually started to increasing, only in the last few years, because I think that labor income declining in the case of developing countries also relate to the larger amount of surplus labor in rural area. When you have a large amount of surplus labor, then that put pressure on the wages. But once you have surplus labor disappear, and the wages will start to increase. So this is what happened in China. We so-called, some people said, some research said China reached the Lewis turning point. So the point that now additional labor get out of the agriculture sector will be only possible if you increase the wages.
But wasn't the data? Sorry to interrupt. But wasn't the data that you showed that was that the labor share of income was increasing almost everywhere? Decreasing.
Yeah. But they did only up to 2007. Now there's more recent data show that in the since 2010 actually, the labor income share as a percent of GDP started increasing or bottomed out.
Okay.
Yeah, so I agree that that is the issue, but the question is, from our point of view, the trade-off between equity and the efficiency and equity. So that is but there are other forces that change that picture. But of course, still we think the revenue side is basically mainly to provide a financing as to more spending on the education and health, kind of social, but not use this as directly in order to reduce inequality, so redistribution. So that is our view in our report. As I said, this is different from the IMF report, the study that is emphasizing both spending and revenue side. Yeah. So that is, and progress. I think the second question is about overall. I think I answered some
how
of
can you shake up the system?
Yeah.
What do we do on Monday morning to shake up the system?
But obviously this needs a political will, and but I think there's a question about whether this report is ADB's view or I think of course this is ADB's view, but ADB's because as a development bank, our role is not just to provide financing, but also policy options, policy kind of recommendations, and we try to lead the kind of discussion, that kind of issues, and provide, of course, the opportunity to discuss with the government and to make sure that we are these kind of issues, emerging issues, will be addressed, to work closely with the government, and then sort of policy dialogue for knowledge sharing. It is ADB's report, I think, but what we try is kind of a policy dialogue, and try to influence the government's thinking. But of course, on the other hand, even without, many countries are taking action. In the case of, again, China, fiscal reform is very much on agenda in the government overall reform plan, including personal income tax reform. Basically, the government has said want to increase the proportion of direct tax. Now China is about half of the tax revenue from VAT, from consumption tax. So the government wants to increase the direct tax as the overall contribution. And as I said, personal income tax is obviously the target. The corporate income tax, China's corporate income tax is not low. It is comparable with OECD country. The VAT is about 10% of GDP, so it's very high. Compared to, I think OECD country is about 6-7%, so very high. But of course, the VAT is easier to collect. That is being considered.
And the sort of the final question from
international
from where we go to lunch. I think there's this issue about the OECD BEPS project, and I think it's important. So the base erosion and profit shifting, and there is this this problem that in the future it's likely that the corporate income tax will be is likely to be eroded through profit shifting, and that might erode sort of the base in the future basis for corporate income tax. Do you see that as a big issue? Is the BEPS project going fast enough? Is it well? It has a time schedule.
No, I know this is under G20 initiative, so we. Of course, this is the part we have not looked at. But overall, I think we have a group in our ADB. They are working closely with OECD, with G20, and kind of initiative. But more as a kind of a policy, we provide write policy papers, notes, and but not really sort of like landing or kind of. But of course. Whatever global initiative agreed, and the ADB always support that. If there's some consensus, mostly we supported that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I think that brings us to the end. So I think we had an excellent presentation and a very stimulating informal discussion about many aspects of the report. So on the macroeconomic side, the Venn chart for China is very narrow. We were at least the discussions that you've provided, so that we think that you think that there's reason to be cautiously optimistic with a 7.5% growth rate. Increase in developing Asia growth rate, and then we had a very interesting discussion, important discussion about many aspects of fiscal policy, both on the tax side and on the spending side, which touches upon a lot of important topical debates, as well as long-term debates, as Oliver reminded us, so that there have been long-term debates. But I also think it also important for these debates on the OECD that you mentioned, and so it's a very relevant report, and we're very, very grateful for you and the Asian Development Bank for discussing it here with us. And so let us thank Dr. Zhang, and then we have lunch, which is, I think, over there on the right, William, if I'm right. You're invited to have an informal lunch with the Asian Development Bank. So thank you very much for that. So thank you, Dr. Zhang.
Thank you.
And the panelists.